Well, good afternoon, and thank you for coming. Thank you for coming to this year's Earl A. Snyder Lecture in International Law. The Snyder Lectures in International Law are held in memory of Earl Snyder, a 1947 Indiana University law graduate. It serves as a unique partnership between us, the IU Maurer School of Law, and Cambridge University. The annual lectures are alternatively held either here in Bloomington or in England. The Endowed Snyder Lecture Series complements another very generous gift that Earl Snyder made, the Snyder Scholarship. The scholarship allows one of our students to visit Cambridge to conduct research at the Cambridge Center for International Law at the Lauterpacht Centre. The Snyder Scholarship is a coveted honor for one of our students, and it promotes global intellectual exchange that we aim to foster here at the law school while assisting students to pursue significant interest in international law. We've been fortunate many prominent international law scholars and practitioners have been chosen by the universities to deliver the Snyder Lectures, which are subsequently published in the Indiana Journal of Global Legal Studies. And I'm very pleased to recognize that a large number of the members of the journal are here in the audience today. Thank you for coming. And I also wanted to remind you that the Journal of Global Legal Studies next week on Thursday and Friday will be hosting their 26th annual symposium. This year's topic is Globalization in Question, Populist Resistance, and a New Politics of the Law. Did I get that right, Fred? Yeah. I've got the seal of approval. I'm also pleased to welcome several others here today. We haven't done this before, but I wanted to take a moment to recognize several of our distinguished SJD scholars that are joining us today that come from all over the world. Would you stand just for a second so we can recognize those in the SJD program? You have no choice in this, so you got to stand. So this will take 2 seconds as they move quickly. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you being part of the community. And I'm not certain he was able to make it, but I know he planned to attend. I wanted to recognize Vice President Emeritus Patrick O'Meara, who was IU's first Vice President of International Affairs, who was hoping to join us today. Today, this year's annual Snyder Lecture will be given by Professor Surabhi Ranganathan from Cambridge University. She is a university lecturer in international law, a fellow at the Lauterpacht Centre for International Law, and a fellow and director of studies in law at King's College at the University of Cambridge. She is also a fellow at the Cambridge Centre for Environment, Energy, and Natural Resource Governance. Her research explores histories and politics of international law with a current focus on the designation, representations, and regulation of global commons, especially the deep seabed. She is currently the co-editor of International Legal Theory section of the Leiden Journal of International Law, and she previously served as the assistant editor of the British Yearbook of International Law and as an editor-chief of the Cambridge Student Law Review. Prior to joining the Faculty of Law, she was an assistant professor at the University of Warwick. She was also with the Institute for International Law and Justice at New York University School of Law. She clerked for Justice Kumar of the Supreme Court of India and interned with a number of UN organizations. She received her BA and LLB from the National Law School of India, her LLM from NYU School of Law, and her PhD from Cambridge. I've said this before, but what have I done with my life? Please join me in welcoming Professor Surabhi Ranganathan.
Thank you, Dean Parrish, for your kind words. I bring you warm greetings from the law faculty, from the Lauterpacht Centre for International Law, and from all of us who work there. We greatly appreciated and enjoyed your visit, and we look forward to playing hosts again for the next round of the Cambridge-Indiana Exchange, which of course is not only a testament to the friendship between our institutions, but also commemorates the memory of Earl Snyder, who was so generous with his gifts to both of our institutions. For today, though, I must express my own delight at being here and having this opportunity to talk to you about my research. I thought what I might do is tell you about some of the work that I'm doing for a book project on international law and the ocean. The book aims to offer a story of the co-production of the two, the law and the ocean, over the course of the 20th century. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, I seek to explore firstly the legal shaping of the ocean, as over the 20th century, it went from being juridically defined as a smooth blue space, what you see on the slide to your left, and went on to become this very minutely differentiated space, which is describable in terms of a multiplicity of zones, a multiplicity of mediums, and a multiplicity of functions. The ocean today is cluttered, it is extensively occupied, and largely enclosed, and I try to understand how we got from there to here. Important in this story were, of course, technological and economic changes, which enabled new uses of the ocean, but the law also played a significant part in promoting and normalizing these uses and the views of the ocean as necessarily catering to these uses. So that's one part of the story of co-production. The second part of the story is that via a focus on the ocean, I explore the shaping of international law itself. Now, as you might know, there has been a lot of interest in the history of international law in recent years, perhaps because legal scholars are trying to figure out why it is that we find ourselves in the global order that we find ourselves in today. So the histories tell us quite a lot. They tell us about why we have the rules we have. They tell us about what these rules do, and they tell us about how these rules are made. They tell us also about how power and inequality might speak through the law, but perhaps may also be combated through it. The histories, as currently written, do quite a lot for us. They give us a settled chronology. Is that better? Great. They give us a settled chronology. They give us a roster of critical events, and they give us a cast of characters who mattered for the making of the law. However, these histories are overwhelmingly histories of land. They're about the legal regulation of state territory and state interests that are predominantly concerned with land, and they fail to take the ocean into account. And the ocean is, of course, important. The ocean was important as a domain, it was important as a resource, and also as a space of imagination, all of which made it a particularly fertile site for debates over the development of the law in the 20th century. The ocean presented opportunities and challenges that were quite different from those that arose with respect to land, and focusing on it orients us towards different chronologies, different events, and different characters, and therefore allows us to refract and complement the existing histories of international law. And therefore, I focus on the ocean to write a contextual history of international law, to bring to fore the interplay of factors, the choices, anxieties, pressures, and projects that shaped the actions and decisions of different actors, and by extension, the present forms, practices, and orientations. The book, therefore, is a story of co-production. It offers conjoined stories of the legal production of the ocean and the oceanic production of the law. And in this talk, I'd like to tease out this conjointedness a little further by examining how the law has given shape to one part of the ocean, the seafloor, and exploring the factors that have shaped the development of this law. And in exploring these factors, I'd like to make 2 points. Firstly, a sort of Marxist point, I'd like to talk about how the law's development has been such as to cater to the ocean's economic exploitation, primarily. But secondly, a contextualist point that complicates any Marxist analysis is to point to the fact that the design of the law and the outcomes that the law brings about was not necessarily as a result of interests in exploiting the ocean, but in fact arose from a variety of other factors. The agents who were writing the law were writing this law for many, many different motivations, and I'd like to talk about some of these motivations today, pointing to the fact that many of these people were not even directly interested in or concerned with the ocean itself. Now, in order to do all of this, I'd like to proceed by way of 3 steps, or 3 short stories, if you will. Firstly, assuming that not all of you are very closely acquainted with the seabed, I'd like to offer you a brief history of it to tell you how it came into view, how it became an object of interest for lawyers, and I'll speak to its current and potential uses. My second story will then highlight the shape that the law has given to the seabed. I'll talk to you about how the law carves up the seabed and the pretexts on which it does so. And my third story will be the why story, the story that digs a little deeper and suggests that actually a confluence of factors shaped the law that we have today. At the end of the talk, I'll come back to why recognizing the contingency of the law's production is important for us today. So let me start then with the very first story, which is a brief history of the seabed. And let me start with saying the seabed genuinely has a brief history as compared with histories of the ocean, which might be written as long histories covering several centuries. The seabed itself didn't really appear into view even well into the 19th century. In fact, up until the middle of the 19th century, it wasn't even well understood that the ocean had a floor. And here you have a very interesting, a very nice vignette from anthropologist Stefan Helmreich, who tells us about this view, speaks to this view in which the ocean is not necessarily seen as having a real bottom. In fact, the thinking is that possibly water solidifies at greater and greater depths, creating several floors on which objects sink. It was in 1854, that the first depth map of the seafloor was created. It was drawn by Matthew Fontaine Maury, who worked for the US Navy up until the American Civil War, when he went off to fight for the South. Now, Maury's map was of a small part of the seabed. It was of the North Atlantic floor, and it was quite inaccurate by present standards because Maury, of course, didn't have a lot of data to draw upon. A lot of the work was done by his imagination. And one of the things he imagined into the ocean was what he thought was this very flat plateau in the middle of the North Atlantic, suggesting that most of the Atlantic seabed was shallow and quite benign, quite flat. And this inspired another man, Cyrus Westfield, to try and lay a transatlantic telegraph cable across the seabed. Underwater cables had by then been laid in shallow stretches of the sea, and Westfield thought, quite rightly, that a telegraph cable connecting America with Britain would be immensely profitable. He founded the Atlantic Telegraph Company, and after some setbacks, the seafloor not being as benign as Maury had predicted, succeeded in the 1860s. And thus, undersea cables became the first significant use of the ocean floor, inspiring improvements in dredging and cable laying technologies. In time, telegraph cables would be joined by telephone cables, and then later internet cables, and would come to crisscross not just the Atlantic, but also all other seafloors. So here you see the cables on the Pacific seafloor. But to come back to these very first cables, one of the important facts that they brought to light, the process of lowering them and raising them for repairs brought to light, was that the ocean depths were not, as had been supposed for a very long time, devoid of life. In fact, ocean depths teemed with life. And this discovery spurred further and more detailed study of the ocean floor. Major expeditions were launched for this purpose. The most famous of these you might have heard of was the Challenger expedition, which was funded by the Royal Society of London and sailed from 1872 to 1876, bringing back a wealth of information, specimens of exotic marine fauna, rock samples, and other geological data, and also measurements of ocean depths from oceans all over the world. In fact, the Challenger's depth measurements were important because they helped oceanographers of the time to reach a vague idea of the uniformity of the ocean floor. So everywhere they suggested the ocean floor more or less followed a similar structure. To some extent, there was a narrow ledge that jutted out from land. This they call the continental shelf. At some point, this ledge would begin to break away. It would sort of go into a steeper decline, become the continental slope, and would then taper off and give way to a flat plain at the bottom, which they call the abyssal plain. Over the next half century or so, interest coalesced around the uses of the shelf. The shelf was already known to provide a resting ground for things like oysters and pearls, which could be recovered by diving operations. If any of you have read Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, that actually contains a very nice description of a pearl diving operation. In the 1930s, seismic profiling also began to reveal the presence of oil on the continental shelf. And soon after the Second World War, drilling for this oil began in earnest. And in fact, drilling technology improved very rapidly. The drilling moved further and further away from the shore. And so oil became the second major use of the seabed in the 1940s and 50s. And nor was oil the only game in town. Seismic profiling, which had revealed oil, had also revealed the presence of other minerals. So by the 1960s, companies were drilling for diamonds off the Namibian continental shelf, De Beers running the first operation, tin of Thailand, zirconium of Australia, and gold of Alaska. So this then became a third major use of the seabed. Meanwhile, the deep seabed was also coming into focus. Already it had been used for laying cables. Then events like the sinking of the Titanic and the two world wars created an interest in mapping its depths more precisely to know what it contained and to see how it might be used for various defensive purposes. After the Second World War, money poured into oceanographic research of the deep seabed, and ever more adventurous projects were taken. To mention just two of these projects, in the 1950s, scientists at the Lamont Geological Observatory in New York began a project of mapping the entire seafloor. The team, Marie Thapp and Bruce Heason, produced really beautiful ocean floor maps. This is an example of the map they drew. These were physiogeographic maps that purported to show how the ocean floor would look if all of the water was removed. And they gave to their audience a sense that they could now visualize what really lay at the bottom of the ocean. A second ambitious project was one that thought about drilling right through the ocean floor down to the next layer of the Earth's mantle, to see what it contained. And this was an important project because it produced lots of improvements in deep sea drilling technology, leading to the perfection of the deep sea drill ship, which of course then generated speculations about how it might be used for economic purposes, for recovering resources, if there were any, on the deep ocean floor. And right on cue, resources were found on the deep ocean floor in the form of polymetallic nodules. Now, the presence of these nodules had actually been known for a while. The Challenger expedition had brought up samples. It described these samples as looking like dirty potatoes, but containing, on chemical analysis, very high concentrations of minerals, of metals like manganese, iron, copper, and cobalt, all of which would have been useful for industrial purposes. They couldn't do very much with this knowledge at the time because there was no prospect of commercially recovering these nodules. But now in the 1960s, those commercial prospects seem brighter. And so these nodules became the fourth potential use of the seabed. And I say potential use because, of course, there was a lot of excitement about these in the 1960s and 70s. But the actual fact is that even today, we're yet to begin deep seabed mining in any significant way. And I'll come back to this point at the end. Other possibilities were also being explored. So military espionage needs had propelled the US Sea Labs program, the idea behind which was that aquanauts, like astronauts, could be housed in the deep ocean for spying and for hardware recovery. And from here, it was a very short step to visions of underwater human habitation, which were visions that were very popular at a time when it was thought that the population was growing so rapidly that the land would be exceeded. And so here again, there was a thought about how working the deep seabed might be a first step towards colonizing it for human needs. Now, with these growing uses, both actual uses and projected imaginative uses, it became clear that the old law of the sea would no longer suffice. The old law of the sea had been the principle of the freedom of the seas. The seas were seen as a great commons, common to the use of all states, on the principle of freedom. So anyone could use the seas. There were very few limitations as to its use. All of this had served well uses such as navigation and fishing, but they wouldn't work for things like seabed mining because mining companies knew that they would have to make investment into specific sites. And for this, then they would need to survey these sites. They would need to build equipment that was particular to these sites. And to do so, they needed some assurance that they would have secure tenure and exclusive access to these sites. And so freedom wouldn't work. They needed, in fact, someone, a state or an international agency, to be able to give them assurance that they would have exclusive access to these sites. And so the freedom of the seas principle needed replacing. Now, of course, this was understood less clear to everyone was what should replace it. What should be, whether should states exercise jurisdiction over the entire seabed? Should the seabed be given over to an international agency? And you can imagine that there was a variety of interests in these outcomes. To give you just a flavor, here in the US, the National Petroleum Council wanted the United States to claim all the oil-containing continental shelf of the US coast as part of the US territory, but US defense interests didn't want this. They were afraid that this kind of creeping jurisdiction would, of course, be matched by the creeping jurisdiction of other states. Those states would enclose very large portions of their own continental shelves, possibly also the waters above, and they would no longer be able to sail their naval craft close to the shores of other states, which would then, of course, inhibit spying and so on, very important in the Cold War. So the CIA, in fact, produced this scare map to show what the ocean might look like if every state extended its national claims to its continental shelf to a very great extent. suggesting that what would happen as a result would be that the entire ocean would get divided up into these great national lakes, and navigation would become impossible. So they had different interests from the oil interests. States which had short or no coastlines obviously wanted all of the ocean to be placed under international jurisdiction because they didn't see what they would get from national jurisdiction. States with long coastlines wanted the opposite. Developing states, which had a big role to play in the development of the law of the sea, were very torn. On the one hand, they wanted exclusive fishing rights and exclusive rights to their own continental shelf oil. On the other hand, they didn't have deep sea mining technology, and so they were keen for an arrangement to be reached where they would also have the chance to benefit from the riches of the deep sea. They wouldn't be hindered from this benefit by the lack of technology. Corporations wanted legal certainty, but no costs. But third world formations like the non-aligned movement, the group of 77, and so forth, wanted a very strong component of redistribution. They thought all users of the seafloor must generate benefits for all states, not just states that were capable of mining the seafloor. In fact, they said that they wanted the law of the sea not to replicate past colonial frameworks where a few states had ruled the world and benefited at the expense of the many. They wanted instead the law of the sea to become their testing ground for a new international economic order, which was marked by political equality and economic justice between states. So the law of the sea that emerged from the end of the Second World War up until between this period, between 1945, say, and 1982, when the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which consolidated all of these interests and produced a sort of formal legal regime, which is now described as the Constitution of the Oceans. These 40 years, we saw not only this great debate on who the ocean should belong to and how the ocean should be used, but also led to the formation of quite a singular legal imaginary of the ocean, which carved up the ocean in very interesting ways. And I'm going to describe that imaginary to you now. And so here we move to my second short story, which is how the law constructs the seabed. And I'm going to tell you that the law carves up the seabed in three very significant ways. Firstly, it divides it into zones of national and international jurisdiction. Secondly, it divides it by medium into zones of ocean floor and sea water. And thirdly, it divides it into regimes that are addressed to living resources and non-living resources. And cumulatively, in doing so, it does two things. It makes the ecosystems of the ocean invisible, and it renders up the ocean basically for extractive uses, for mining of different kinds. So let's look at this story. Now, the law firstly divides the seabed into zones of national and international jurisdiction. National jurisdiction is extended over what is legally described as, but geologically is not or need not be, the continental shelf. And in this area, coastal states are given exclusive rights to exploit seabed resources. The rest of the seabed constitutes the international area. This is administered by an international agency. And here the rules require, in some vague sense, that the resources must be recovered to the benefit of all mankind. This means that the international agency is empowered to issue licenses for seabed mining, but equally also to collect some portion of the profit derived from seabed mining for redistribution among states. Now, the key question is how and where is this line drawn and on what basis? I've already told you that until the 1940s, there was no line drawn. All of the sea was seen as unified, as a smooth space. So some basis for drawing this line had to be found. But equally, until the 1940s, most of the sea was governed by the principle of the freedom of the seas. And so states knew that in making claims for national jurisdiction, they had to overcome an idea of the law that had persisted for several centuries. They essentially had to make a persuasive case for why a part of the ocean should no longer be considered a common, but amenable to national jurisdiction. And the argument that they made was that the continental shelf could be enclosed because it was simply a prolongation of state territory. It was a natural prolongation. It was naturally appurtenant to state territory. And to the extent that it could be seen as naturally pertinent, it could be enclosed. It was different from the rest of the sea. Claiming it was not enclosing the sea. It was simply reclaiming land which belonged to the state already. And this idea of natural prolongation has remained part of the law. You see it being expressed here in the definitions of the continental shelf that were articulated by the World Court, the International Court of Justice, and by the Convention on the Law of the Sea. But, and here is where it gets interesting, the law cites natural prolongation, but it does not really actually rely on geological evidence in delimiting the shelf. It rejects the natural dividing line between the shelf and the slope, which geologists had always known of, because this was not amenable to oil interests. It also rejects a further dividing line between what is known as the continental margin, so the bottom of the slope, and the deep sea bed, which are geologically, which have different physical properties. They are recognized as being different entities. But this line also is not really followed in the law, because again, states which had very short continental margins thought it would be very unfair for them. It would be really unfair for them because they'd get very little of the sea's bed under their jurisdiction, and other states would get quite a lot. And so ultimately, the limits were set by agreement. All states were allocated 200 miles of the seabed from their coasts as their continental shelf. This was regardless of whether the shelf itself or even whether the continental margin extended this far. This means that there are some states which basically have brought in bits of the deep sea floor within the national jurisdiction on the basis that this is a continental shelf. Geology was brought in by the back door in that states which had very long continental margins were allowed to claim extended continental shelves up to 350 miles instead of 200 miles, as long as they agreed to share a portion of the revenue that they derived from the extra 150 miles. So the law uses geology where it's convenient. It dismisses the geology when it's not convenient. What it does is it reinscribes the continental shelf in a legal way. So it takes what is essentially discontinuous, featureful, quite discrete set of spaces. Most continental shelves are not alike. There are different kinds of continental shelves. In the law, however, they're all rendered as the same, as smooth, and as 200 miles. So the second distinction made by the law is even more interesting in some ways. Here, the law separates the seabed from the sea waters and places them under separate regimes. The law applicable to the deep seabed is not applicable to the waters above, which are the high seas, which are governed by the principle of freedom. And similarly, the law applicable to the continental shelf is not applicable to the waters above, which may be either claimed by states as their exclusive economic zones, from which they may harvest resources, but in which they must allow free navigation, or they might be, if they're not proclaimed as exclusive economic zones, be simply high seas, governed by the principle of freedom. The reason why the law makes this division is again to reconcile uses of the sea that rely on the principle of freedom, such as navigation, with uses that require legal security of tenure, such as seabed mining. Again, this is presented as a natural division. Water and land are very different mediums. Lawyers told us very grandly in the 1950s, as if they discovered this fact for themselves for the first time. They even tried to work up a different legal fiction, claiming that a very thin membrane, almost like a laminating sheet, separated the seabed from the waters above, so that users of the seabed would have no effects on the waters above. Now, this sort of fiction was hard to maintain. Nobody could find this little laminating layer. But it made it very hard for them to actually describe what counts as a resource of the seabed and what counts as a resource of the water. How do we know what lies on the bed, and how do we distinguish that from what lies in the water? And so they produced a series of thumb rules which were pretty incoherent. Let me describe some of these to you. So one of the things they said was that all non-living resources, regardless of the medium, must belong to the seabed. So oil, minerals, everything is a resource of the seabed. As far as living resources are concerned, those that can be considered sedentary, so either immobile or able to move only in contact with the seabed, must be regarded as resources of the seabed. And so things like corals, sponges, clams are allocated to the seabed, even though these live in the water as much as they might on the bed. And many of them flourish better in shallow water. Some of them even break the surface. They may be quite far away from the seabed in where they ordinarily live, but they're seen as resources of the seabed. Moreover, crustaceans. So things like prawns, Crabs, shrimps, lobsters, these are also allocated to the seabed, even though they can swim. But according to the law, they don't swim. They're sedentary. They belong to the seabed. On the other hand, bottom-dwelling fish, like that crocodile fish that you see in the slide on the left-hand corner, or the puffer fish that live on the seabed, that breed on the seabed, and that have a much more intimate relationship with the ecosystems of the seabed, are described as resources that belong to the water, not the bed, and therefore addressed under a different legal regime. So here we see then some of the ways in which legal divisions don't really make sense. Even though they're described, this division is described as natural, it begins to break down when we see how it is actually addressed to the different creatures that live in the oceans. In the deep seabed, we see an even more stark distinction at work. Actually, let me come to it in a minute. So in the deep seabed, the division is made simply between resources that are living and resources that are not living. And of course, all of these things are configured as resources, right? That's the language. We don't talk about the contents of the ocean or the life that lives in the ocean. We talk about the resources. The resources that are non-living all belong to the seabed. Living resources are governed by the principle of the high seas. Now, this, of course, avoids the vague sedentary, non-sedentary distinction that is used for the continental shelf, but it is problematic in other ways. And this is an example of that. So what you're looking at is a hydrothermal chimney. These develop from vents that are formed at sites of tectonic activity. They can grow up to 60 meters in height. These vents release minerals into the water, deep earth minerals into the water, which precipitate and consolidate around these chimneys, making them very attractive from a mining perspective. But these vents also thrive with life. Curious life forms are born here. Chemosynthetic bacteria that you see on the left of the slide. These are bacteria that feed on the minerals that are released by these vents. They live on and inside these vents and form the starting point of what is called the dark food chain, a food chain quite different from the ones that we are part of that relies not on light, but on sulfur, which is generated at these hydrothermal vents. And you see here the kinds of species that feed off these bacteria and become part of this food chain. The law ignores the symbiotic relationship between the bacteria and the vents when it places them under different regimes. And I was speaking to an anthropologist about this, and he made an interesting point to me. He said, apparently, it is still debated whether chemosynthetic bacteria should even be seen as living resources, making it even less clear, or they're things that move between life and non-life, making it less clear what the law should be that applies to them. But again, jurisdictionally, they are not part of the seabed regime. So these are some of the ways in which the law makes invisible the nested ecosystems that constitute the ocean. Instead, juridically, the law constructs the ocean as separable, as divisible by national and international jurisdiction, divisible by land and water mediums, and divisible by living and non-living contexts and fixed and mobile forms of life. Why does it do this? The answer that I have so far pressed is that these divisions facilitate extractive activity. They remove social barriers to seabed mining, which are in the view that the ocean is a great commons. They also remove ecological barriers to seabed mining because they make us less attentive to the impacts that such mining might have on the life forms that cluster about in the oceans. These divisions thus serve the interests of some corporations and some states, and this orientation of the law and its constitutive effects for the ocean must absolutely be recognized. But having said this, I now want to offer some complicating annotations to my own story. For recognizing the law's role in facilitating economic activity should not lead us to think that the activity or the need for it was simply givens and the law was simply responding to these needs. The law is not simply a response. The needs are not just out there. They were also actively constructed through the law. And those agents of the law, the people who led the construction of this economic value, that needed a certain accompanying physical construction of the ocean, these people were led by multiple motives, some of which were very little concerned with the ocean itself. So the history of why we have the law we have is actually a very messy one. And that mess is the subject of my third short story. So in the interests of time, I'm going to make this story very short indeed. It's the equivalent of Twitter's terribly tiny tales. I'll just briefly mention the reification of the economic model for the continental shelf. So of course, there was an interest in the continental shelf oil, but there was no clarity on how or under what conditions mining should be carried out. It was really a group of international lawyers who led the charge here, suggesting that states could claim the continental shelf. There wasn't any need for redistribution, and that recovery of petroleum from the shelf, by definition, would benefit mankind. What was driving them was not necessarily an interest in petroleum itself, but a certain kind of anxiety about the future of international law. So in the period just after the Second World War, there was a lot of uncertainty about what would happen to international law. Could states be brought to believe in international law? And these lawyers suggested that unless the law was shown to be adaptable, to be flexible, to be accommodative of the needs of the world, people might lose interest in the law and turn to other mediums for engaging in international relations. And so they moved very quickly to junk the freedom principle where it was not helpful and come up with a different basis for the enclosure of the seabed. I'd like to dwell a little bit more on the deep seabed, because here we really see how the law constructs both an account of the need and the accompanying vision of the seabed. So firstly, we should think about what triggered the world's interest in deep seabed minerals. I had mentioned the discovery of polymetallic nodules, and sure, those stirred some interest in a context where it seemed that industrial needs were growing and the world's supply was becoming less assured, because this was, of course, the era of the Cold War and the era of decolonization. And so some of especially Western states couldn't simply assume that they would get the resources that they needed. But it took a feat of individual imagination to make all of these links between the needs of the world, the economic potential of the ocean, and the possibility of using the ocean for inclusive economic growth by way of legal regulation. And these links were made by a man called Arvid Pardo, who was then ambassador of Malta to the United Nations, in the course of a 3.5-hour speech to an enthralled UN General Assembly. It's a fantastic speech. It's very worth reading. In this speech, Pardo presents not only a very rich, although exaggerated account of ocean riches, he also convinces the assembled states that these were quite easily recoverable. And he also sold a combination of hope and fear to the assembled delegates. So he said, on the one hand, the minerals could feed accelerated economic growth. They could make up for shortages on land. Their riches could be redistributed and could substitute for development aid, which at the moment was being given by first world states to third world states. So this was the fantasy. On the other hand, unless regulated by law, individual states would rush to colonize the seabed, and the language of colonialism was quite particularly effective in the 60s. They would rush to colonize the seabed to get exclusive benefit of these minerals. There would be a scramble for the seabed that resembled the scramble for Africa in the previous century, and the UN should try to prevent this. The General Assembly should get cracking on a treaty that would set up an international agency to regulate seabed mining. Now, Pardo's intervention was very influential, and I'll come to some of the reasons why in a minute. What I want to say first is that what is often overlooked is that Pardo was not particularly interested in or committed to the oceans himself. His intervention was driven by a whole host of other factors, including a desire to put Malta on the map of international relations. So Pardo had been a former UN civil servant. He had been headhunted 3 years before he made the speech by the first prime minister of a newly independent Malta to craft Malta's international relations and to secure its position in the world and in the Mediterranean. He was made Malta's chief ambassador to the UN, to the United States, and to Europe. He was given an office in New York and a staff of 3, and with these meager resources, he was told to make an impact. Now, he realized very quickly that he needed a big ticket issue that he could associate with Malta. And he flirted with quite a few, including arms control, before hitting on the seabed, which he recalls he heard about for the first time at a cocktail party 15 months before he made his speech. This was an issue he found interesting for a variety of reasons. Of course, it would bring, initiating a big lawmaking endeavor at the UN would bring notoriety to Malta. Pardo also hoped that if an international agency was set up, maybe its headquarters would be placed in Malta, which would, of course, bring both money and jobs. And thirdly, being seen as a country that had expertise in the law of the sea might actually be helpful for securing Malta's interests in the Mediterranean against all of the other states that were also interested in the resources of that sea. And so many factors determined Pardo's interest in the ocean. And of course, I did say at the beginning that he wasn't particularly interested. It's very clear that once he hit upon the issue and read about it, Pardo became a very committed advocate for the law of the sea. And so, expertise comes for different reasons and in different ways. And his is a classic story of why an issue that had really not interested him became then the thing that defined his life and his legacy. So it was a powerful intervention. It was an intervention that had an immediate impact. Many UN speeches basically have no afterlife, right? You go and make a speech at the UN, and then you finish that speech and you go away, and it doesn't matter. Pardo's catalyzed an immediate burst of activity. And there are many reasons for this influence. One of them being that developing states who were initially skeptical about the seabed and about what Pardo was telling them were soon brought to think about how it might fit into their vision for a new international economic order, which was what they termed this idea of changing the legal, the political, and the economic arrangements of the world in a way that would foster equality and justice between states. So they said ocean minerals, lying as they were in a terrain that had not really been legally addressed so far, could provide not just a new source of income, but also a new terrain for more equitable lawmaking. And therefore, from 1968 to 1982, they participated with great fervor and enthusiasm in the drafting of a new treaty for the law of the sea, the 1982 agreement, the Constitution of the Oceans. These were protracted and costly negotiations. They occupied lawyers and diplomats in an exhausting way for 15 or more years. They were also negotiations founded on myth. As it turns out, seabed mining was not a particularly plausible activity in the 1970s and 80s. The heady days of the 60s had given way to concerns that there was no actual mining technology available that could allow mining to be carried out in an economical way. And the demand for these minerals was not as great as had been speculated on in the 60s. In fact, the very same developing states who were pushing for a seabed mining regime were also terrified about the impact that seabed minerals might have on their own export markets, because they were the producers of many of the minerals that were now sought to be recovered from the seabed. And they sought assurance through legal limitations on production that their markets would be protected. So here we have the law making seabed mining an economic activity, the law creating a regime in which it would be possible both to protect developing states' earnings through exports and make the mining itself, recovering minerals from the sea, a commercially attractive activity. Now, the question, of course, is why did developing states continue to give the seabed issue so much importance? And many explanations are mooted for this. One of them being just ideology, that this became a third world struggle against the first world. This was, the material rewards were not as important. The ideological victory mattered more. One of the lawyers I spoke to said that really what happened was that all the economists went to the UNCTAD and all the lawyers went to the UN conferences on the law of the sea, and the lawyers didn't care about economic outcomes. They wanted a legal regime. But part of the explanation must also be that actually developing states were fed both direct and indirect misinformation by other actors from developed states. And many reasons, Henry Kissinger was one of the people who went on a world tour, speaking to many developing states and in sort of bilateral meetings, telling them that seabed mining was absolutely important. It was an economic activity, and that negotiations should continue in a fruitful way for that reason. There are many ways in which we might try to explain why seabed mining was being sort of impressed upon developing states as an important activity. One of them must surely be that it allowed some of the impetus for the new international economic order to be directed towards it in return for concessions that could be obtained elsewhere. So concessions in relation to international commodity agreements, concessions in relation to other aspects of the law of the sea, free navigation through straits, and so forth. The fact that the seabed issue was seen as of continuing importance allowed a lot of energy to be sucked out, I think, from the movement for the new international economic order. And so agents of developed states as well as developing states played their part in reifying the economic prospects of seabed mining and in prolonging the pursuit of the law on the seabed. So here we had, of course, economic interests, but not really interests that were concerned with the oceans, but were concerned with all sorts of other things. Deep seabed minerals were perhaps less important for their own sake and more as projections of the different visions for a new international economic order. Now, I could go on in this vein, but let me take stock now of what I've been trying to tell you. So far, what I've tried to do through my 3 stories is to try to problematize what we take to be givens about the ocean, the physical divisions, the economic uses, and try to tease out how these were actually constructed through the law, but also emphasize that the constructions through the law were themselves contingent on a variety of other factors, not necessarily interests in the ocean, but other objectives relating to the place of the law in the world and the place of international relations. Why do I emphasize this? Well, today, I think it's important to recognize that the ocean is at a really perilous crossroads. So this is just an example of how the law turns the ocean from a rich ecosystem to actually this map, which is a map of different mining claims. The reason we need to recognize this, as I was saying, is that the ocean is at a very difficult crossroads. This crossroads is summed up in the very outcome document of a UN conference on the oceans that was held last year. This document is quite an interesting read. On the one hand, it speaks to the continuing economic potential of the ocean. So the ocean is seen as unlocking new possibilities for growth, again, making up for limits of land resources. The document speaks in terms of ideas of blue growth and the blue economy and blue partnerships and the like. On the other hand, the document also recognizes that the ocean is under grave threat. It's under the threat of acidification, it's under the threat of pollution, the threat of overfishing, the threat of resource depletion, all of which have threatened its very delicate ecosystems. So the document recognizes the connection, right? It recognizes that there is a connection between growing uses of the ocean and the growing threats to the ocean. But then it makes a move that is very familiar to us, which is that it relies on the law to provide a solution. The law is supposed to unlock both new uses of the ocean and somehow protect the ocean's ecology. And so we are told that basically what we need is new legal regimes that build on and don't undermine the law that we have already, which already provides for a reconciliation of these interests. Now, such moves are often made and they're problematic because they always place the problem outside of the law. They structure the law as being responsive, as being a solution, as reactive, and not as constitutive. What they fail to recognize is that the ocean we have today, the ocean that we are worrying about, is also produced through the law. And it cannot be saved by building on the imaginary, which has allowed it to reach where it has reached today. So this idea that the law, we should not undermine what has been achieved through the law, is problematic in itself because it writes out the story of the law's complicity with what we have today. Any solution, therefore, will need to overcome not just physical facts about the ocean, but also an imaginary of the law's own creation. And therefore, my talk on recognizing the how and what and why of this imaginary, because understanding that must surely be the first step, even perhaps the step that helps us replace questions like this one that you see on the left of your slide, how to best manage the mining of the seabed, with this one, this question of, well, do we need to mine at all? Why is it that we think of seabed mining as such a normal activity? Why have we spent the last half century negotiating legal regimes for seabed mining? We've obviously not needed these seabed minerals. We haven't begun mining, and yet somehow mining is presented to us as inevitable, and the role of the law is simply to provide structures for how it might be done in a more sustainable way. So can we use the law instead to change the imaginary of the ocean and look at the ocean in a different way? And what will that take? I'll stop here for your questions. Thank you. Yeah, that sounds good.
Thank that the law is framed as it is because of a failure of information and a failure of imagination. And so, one of the things that I thought really about your narrative is wonderful. But in the middle somewhere, there was chronology that I was hoping for, which was sort of chronological discourse or failure to be a discourse between the evolving scientific knowledge of the ocean and the evolving law. Because there was those two things were happening. Well, economic activity that was happening on the seabed floor, laying the communication pipelines, allowed us to get more information about the ocean. And the economic activity has facilitated additional information about the ecology of the ocean. But that information has not been making its way into the development of the law. It didn't make its way into the development of the convention for a lot of the reasons that you explained. But I do think that by the time that the convention was even evolving, not even being finalized, by the time it was really in formation, there was a lot of knowledge about the ocean already available, but not in play in the creation of that law. That's no longer, now we have the convention, but we have a significant amount of additional information that has come to, in a sense, the drafting convention. In fact, the bulk of what we know about the ocean floor has come to the convention since the end of the drafting process. And so I wonder whether instead of whether the law should inform our imaginary, whether what in fact we know about the ocean that helps us to fill in our imagination shouldn't in fact be what informs the branch of oceanic law that might help us carve out sustainability as a possibility. So the convention doesn't actually attend to sustainability. It attends to marketability, to the economy. But now we have more information. So I wonder whether now there's this space in our imagination for the creation of the other side of law, right? That side of law that tends to other human needs, other planetary needs, like sustainability.
So I think that's a great question. If I can digest it, and I was asked to digest it because this is being recorded, I think it's a question of how and when the law receives outside information and makes it part of the process of its own production. And this is a great question, especially in connection with the ocean. You're right that the legal interest in the ocean is triggered by new knowledge about it, which makes all the possible economic uses it can be put to. Somehow many of the other things that were also coming to light, including the fact that the ocean is full of delicate ecosystems, don't find their way into the law. And they don't find their way into the law even when the knowledge about that is expanding. So you're right, in the course of the 15 years that it took to negotiate the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, sort of biological knowledge, geographical knowledge, geological knowledge, all of those improved significantly. And this is where it's important then to think about, firstly, the role that lawyers play, how lawyers make sense of the information. What I found very interesting in reading the records of the Law of the Sea was this almost this distrust of, or not distrust, but this sort of very selective use of what was seen as expert knowledge. So the lawyers had a narrative in their minds about how the ocean would be used, and that narrative governed how the ocean was being looked at. So that was one factor, which is how there were lots of claims to interdisciplinarity that were being made by lawyers in the 60s and 70s, but that didn't really go to trying to make actual sense of the knowledges that were not knowledges of the law, but were scientific knowledges. That was one factor. The second factor, however, was also that there was a problem with how the information was circulating. So another thing that's really interesting about the Law of the Sea negotiations is that, yes, there is all this knowledge. Some people are clearly working with this knowledge. They have access to it. And yet somehow the way in which this knowledge flows gets very distorted. It's filtered through by suspicion, by theories of conspiracy. So amongst the developing states, there was this great sense that there was a lot of conspiracy around the Law of the Sea, that they were being told the wrong things. Initially, they had been told that seabed mining would solve all of the growth problems of the world. Then the estimates about what the ocean contained were being revised downwards, and they didn't buy that story of downward revision. They didn't buy it for many other reasons as well, because they kept getting signals. On the one hand, they were being told the ocean has less than you think it does, or less that is recoverable. On the other hand, there were initiatives that were ongoing. Developed states were pushing quite hard for their preferred version of the seabed regime. And these developing states were sort of sitting and thinking, well, if they're pushing so hard, there must be more there. There were also things that happened that, again, led to the production of fake knowledge. So one of the most interesting episodes in the history of the law of the sea is that in the mid-70s, the CIA wanted to recover a sunken Russian submarine. But they needed a cover story. They didn't want Russia to know that they were trying to recover the sunken submarine. So they floated a story that they were engaging in seabed mining. They built this giant mining ship that they were now using to recover nodules. And of course, it took a while before the real story came out, but it again added to this sense that seabed mining was actually a real activity that was ongoing. Here was this very large ship, the Gloma Explorer, that had been built for this purpose. So there was that. And finally, again, the question, the third issue here is, of course, how does environmental knowledge and ecological knowledge fare when it comes up against economic interest? And that's another set of filters, right? So even now we have a lot more knowledge about the oceans. Ecological interest, one of the things that the International Seabed Authority that has come into operation with the convention has done is that it has brought environmental interest to the fore. It's done quite a lot of work in developing environmental guidelines, but always with the assumption that seabed mining is the given. The environmental stuff that they can develop is what they can do to ameliorate the conditions under which seabed mining might take place. And that already then creates a frame through which sustainability is understood. So sustainability, it's not protecting the seabed for its own sake. It's protecting the seabed to the extent that it won't interfere with the mining interests that exist. So I think these are some of the reasons why we know a lot more about the oceans than we knew then, but I'm skeptical about how much we might take on board what we know and what we might be able to do. I would hope that we might do things differently. We do have an example of a situation where things were done differently, and that's, of course, Antarctica, which was clearly taken out of the realm of places that could be used for economic exploitation and placed under a different kind of legal regime. But there were a host of factors that led to that outcome, and it's difficult to replicate those for the law of the sea, at present at least, though I hope we might. Yeah.
So in the outcome document, there's a reaffirmation that the existing rules should not be it should build upon the existing rules of the UN Convention on Law of the Sea. But from your lecture, I get that the convention was concluded upon misinformation and imagination.
Yeah.
But now as time passes, there is, I think, more views that this rule has become entered into customary international law. Even states which are not parties to it adhere to it, like for example with the United States. And will this contradict the recognized need to adapt and to have newer rules, for example?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So that's a question about what might lead the law to change, and specifically this law. And there are, there's a bigger question there, though, in terms of what we understand by adaptation, right? So the law of the sea actually has changed. The 1982 agreement was followed by what was called an implementation agreement in 1994, but was actually an amending agreement. And so you notice the play of words there. And it did dramatically change the seabed mining regime. What it did was it stripped away most of the redistribution provisions and left in all the mining provisions. It tried to make mining more commercially attractive on the basis actually of new knowledge about the oceans, on the basis that there wouldn't be very much to redistribute because mining would always be quite an expensive operation. And so something else was needed to convince companies to engage in the mining. So the law has changed. The interesting thing is that what was recognized as misinformation or misapprehension was these facts about redistribution and economic justice. What has not been recognized as based on misapprehension or misinformation is the facts about mining. And whether that flip can happen remains to be seen. I think it's very hard for the International Seabed Authority to produce that flip, because then it would be basically questioning the very conditions of its own creation. It was set up basically to be a body that can facilitate seabed mining. It can do the best it can in terms of improving environmental standards, but it can't really say we're going to actually change the very foundations of our own existence and say, international institutions don't do that usually, right?
Unfortunately, out of time, so could you join me in thanking Professor?